Mr. Ryan, I need to administer an oath for you if you'll raise your right hand. Do you solemnly promise and swear that the testimony you provide in this cause now on trial is the truth, whole truth, nothing but the true self you got?
Yes, sir.
You may be seated.
Take calls, Him, Your Honor. Mr. Ryan, could you introduce yourself to the jury?
Yes, sir. My name is Howard J. Ryan.
Could you explain how you became involved in working, performing this forensic work for the State versus Ralph case?
Yes. It was earlier in the fall this past year. We were down in Oak Ridge doing our block of instruction on shooting incident reconstruction, and there were 2 Texas Rangers in the class, one of which was Ranger Mike Adcock from here. And he asked on Wednesday, I believe, of that week if we could take a few minutes after class, and he wished to ask us a few questions about a case he was working on. We said sure.
And at that time, you were serving as an instructor?
Correct. Yes, sir. So he opened up his laptop and he started talking about this particular case, and he didn't tell us right away what it was. And he asked if we could help him with what was left at the scene, some of the photos of the scene regarding the gunshot injuries, the wound patterns, and the bloodstain analysis. And as we began to just talk about the photos, he asked us if there was any way we could assist him with going through their shooting investigation, and we said sure. And that turned into us basically sitting down and doing a shooting reconstruction on this particular event.
Did you request specific material that you needed in order to perform a forensic analysis of this scene for the state?
Yes, sir.
And what information did you request and receive to assist you in preparing that for the state opinions?
We asked and received crime scene photographs, any other visual documentation that they had of the scene. We asked for the investigative reports, any crime scene evidence logs, laboratory submissions, laboratory results, autopsy photographs and autopsy reports, and basically anything. We usually just tell them we need everything, yeah. But those are the itemized lists of what we received.
And did you receive everything you needed?
Yes, sir.
From this analysis, were the photographs of the crime scene that you received, were they of sufficient resolution where you could inspect the surfaces and the victims' bodies and everything that was at the scene for bloodstain patterns?
Yes.
And were you able to formulate opinions regarding this case?
Yes, sir.
Now, to narrow the focus of what types of opinions you were asked to help with, did you analyze the information that you were provided, the autopsy reports, the ballistics reports, gunshot residue reports, as well as the photographs? Did you analyze the potential proximity or closeness of the person who was doing the shooting to the victims when they were killed?
Yes, that was obviously a concern, and it's one of the things we always try to figure out in any shooting scene is position of a shooter in relation to the location or position of a victim. Yes.
Okay. And in many scenes, is that complicated by movement?
In shooting, one thing about shooting scenes is there are always complications with movement, but the evidence a lot of times between the bloodstain evidence left behind and the wound paths or wound tracks will tell you where it took place. And the thing you got to remember is they don't always the dynamics of an incident don't all take place in one specific spot. So the one interesting thing about this case was the movement. That's something we keyed in on right away.
So getting to that, when you began receiving the photographs and the investigative reports and the autopsy reports, what were your initial impressions of this crime scene in general in comparison with other crime scenes that you've worked?
Well, it was very confined. It was a very small area. They were all, it seems certainly that they were all right in the same general area. And specifically one of the things we started to look at, which were very different from victim to victim, were the locations of the wounds, of the gunshot wounds.
What was it that struck you about the gunshot wounds to Chris Kyle and Chad Littlefield?
Well, with Mr. Kyle, first of all, They were all located in one general area on the upper portion of his right side of his body. And to be quite honest, when people look at that, they may not see what's unique about that, but what is unique about it is when gunfire erupts, people move. It's just, we've always seen it in shootings. You see it quite often. The only times you don't see that is when something happens quickly and very decisively.
Does it also factor in on whether the victim of the shooting knows it's coming?
Oh, that's a huge factor in this. And that was clearly the case here. Almost instantly, the first thing that came to mind was specific to Mr. Kyle is he absolutely never saw this coming. These gunshot wounds that struck him in an area that were incapacitating and isolated to a specific area of his body. And that's unusual.
Now, with the very top pattern of shots that were inflicted upon Chris Kyle, does that affect your opinion about how close someone was standing to Mr. Kyle when he was shot?
Well, that could very well be one of the scenarios. Yeah, to achieve that grouping of shots, it is my opinion you would have to be, if they were all administered one right after another. In other words, if all those shots on his body were sustained in one action, one repetitive shot after the other, I would say that it was fairly close. You're not going to get that far away and administer that type of gunfire in a confined area, specifically with the wounds that he sustained. Because two of the wounds, as spoke about in the report by the medical examiner, were fatal wounds. And one of the wounds that struck him in the mandible of the face passed through the oral cavity and struck his spinal cord, would have been immediately incapacitating. It would have put him right down.
So he would have dropped right there where
Yes.
that shot hit.
Yes. So when you think about that many shots, whether they're fired in rapid succession or not, when you have to consider two of those bullets probably would have put him down right away, incapacitated his motor functions, and for the rest of those shots to get in there, it would be pretty remarkable.
So now when you talk about fairly close, besides the pattern of the shots to Chris Kyle's body, suggesting it was done at very close range or relatively close range, were there other factors that you were able to take from the forensic analysis, the ballistics pattern and trajectory of the bullets that suggest to you how close the shooter may have been to Mr. Kyle when the bullets were fired?
With Mr. Kyle, the other thing that we saw in the reports were the presence of gunshot residue in the area on his clothing that were tested around the wounds, and there was the presence of gunshot residue according to the lab results.
Now, can you give a precise distance at which the shots were fired from based on that gunshot residue analysis?
No.
Now, when you talk about gunshot residue, and I know you know all about it, but for our benefit, could you explain just in general layman's term, what are you talking about when you talk about gunshot residue?
Yes, sir. When a weapon is discharged, whether it's a long gun or a pistol or a shotgun, it doesn't matter. The way the bullet is designed to fire is a firing pin strikes a primer. Primer is a small explosion that ignites the larger explosion, which is the gunpowder within the bullet. The projectile is then exposed to the force of that explosion. The back end of that bullet is being pushed, and that's what's causing the bullet to spiral, come down the barrel, and discharge the weapon. In addition to that projectile exiting that muzzle, you also have a substantial amount of burnt, unburnt, and partially burning gunpowder that is still burning off as this whole thing happens. And you got to remember, it happens very quickly in a blink of an eye as this explosion occurs in the gun. So that byproduct of the cartridge exploding also has a ballistic property. It's in motion. It's coming out. Now, the bullet is usually made up of copper or lead or a combination of both, or just lead. it's dense, it's heavy, and it's got a tremendous amount of pressure being applied to the back of it. So with that density and that force, it's going to travel a great distance. The gunshot powder does not have that density, does not have that weight. So it's going to come out of the gun, but where it goes after that, it may peel off out into the side, and it's eventually not going to move any further down away from the muzzle. It just doesn't have the energy or the weight to do it. The interesting thing about that is certain weapons and certain ammunition can be tested for muzzle to target distance. But to do that, to make that test relevant, well, let me explain first what the test is. We'll take the gun in a controlled environment. We fire it at either a white sheet or something at different known distances. And then we'll have our bullet hole, and then we look at our powder pattern around it. So if we have a certain diameter, we can recreate that or compare it to what we may have found at a scene. In this particular scene, we did not have any discernible patterns. We had the presence of gunshot residue, but no discernible pattern. So it kind of made doing a muzzle to target distance on a control a moot point because we didn't have anything to compare it to, but we did have the presence of gunshot residue. So as it discharges the weapon, it will travel, but there are factors involved, that affect how far that gunshot residue will travel before it may stick in your clothing or in your hair or on your skin.
But we're talking about range as a reasonable possibility here. If it was a point blank, say 6 inches to 2 feet, would you have expected to find a discernible pattern from the gun muzzle, from the end of the gun where the gunshot residue blew out with the bullet? Would you expect to be able to have a confined pattern on the body around the wound?
Yes.
And that's fine. Is that fair to say that's 6 inches to 2 feet where you expect to see the pattern?
Well, it all depends on the weapon and the ammo, but yeah, the closer you get, you will see a discernible pattern, and it changes from weapon to weapon and ammo to ammo.
And you didn't see that pattern on Chris Kyle.
Correct.
And so we're not talking about 2 feet within 2 feet for the shots to Chris Kyle.
I don't think so, no.
But what is the potential range? Now, of course, when you shoot from far off, like if I shoot a deer rifle at a deer at 100 yards, you're not expecting there to be any of that gunshot residue travel that far.
No, sir.
And really, it starts dissipating rather quickly.
Yes.
What type of range of distance would you expect for the type of handguns that we had used in this killing? What range of distances would you expect the shooter to have been?
Well, I believe that they actually did some test fires on several of the guns, and with certain ammo it was 6 inches, and with other ammo it was out to 24 inches. That was the items that were specifically used here, but you have to factor other things when you ask how far do I expect it to go. A simple question: are you upwind or are you downwind? Mm-hmm. As this loses energy, it is a powder. It's a fine item that's burning off in the air. You get a strong headwind, and I did notice you have wind here. That could have a very strong effect on how far that gunshot residue may or may not travel.
Now, the gunshots to Chris Kyle were going up the back and side, with one in the side of the face. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
Based on that, is it your opinion that he was facing away from the shooter?
Yes, he definitely was not facing the shooter. I believe that his body was turned where the muzzle was to the right, slightly behind him. And pretty much all of the projectiles fired into the body came from that same direction.
Okay. Now, and then relating that, of course, the other variable that we got to deal with, we have the shooter and we have Chris Kyle, but we also have Chad Littlefield back behind Chris Kyle. We may come back and talk some more about Chris Kyle in a moment, but there were a number of shots inflicted upon Chad from various angles, were there not?
Yes, there were. Now,
the medical examiner had described those just by number from head to toe, right?
Yes.
And it was very clear from his report that was not an ordering of the sequencing of those shots, right?
Correct.
They never do at the ME's office. Have you formulated opinion as to which shots to Chad Littlefield's body were sustained first?
Yes, we have.
Which shots do you believe were inflicted first on Chad Littlefield?
As delineated on that particular diagram you're holding, a shot that is marked number 5 and number 6, I believe were the first two impacts that struck Mr. Littlefield.
And where did they enter his body?
In the back, on either side of the spinal cord, but you can see 6 is almost towards the center of the back, 5 is a little bit off to the right.
Now,
I think it's also important to note they both exited his chest.
so the bullets do not remain in the body.
Correct.
Now, you mentioned the spinal cord in relation to one of these shots, 5 and 6,
Correct.
right here. The medical examiner's report described one of those hitting the spinal column, right?
Yes, sir.
Would that have been an immediate? Would that affect where he fell?
Yes, it could very much affect where he fell.
And what would be your opinion about where Chad Littlefield fell once those first two shots hit him in the back?
If that bullet struck his spinal cord and did significant damage to that spinal cord and the nerves within there, he would probably fall straight down. Almost collapse straight down to where he is, and so, or start to drop to the floor. In other words, as opposed to.
Your Honor, I want to object to this board's non-response.
Sustained.
Okay, so he fell right where he was, essentially, though.
Yes.
Would that be fair to say? Now, based on the crime scene photograph, I mean, did you incorporate into your analysis of finding a gunshot residue on the clothing of Chad Littlefield?
Yes, there was some gunshot residue as well as found by the laboratory.
And did that relate to these wounds to the back as well?
I believe it did.
So these are not long distance shots to the back either.
I don't think so. No.
I want to show you State's Exhibit 38, which depicts both of these men and their position at the crime scene. Based on all the information that you synthesized from the crime scene photos, the bullet trajectories, the presence of GSR, have you formulated an opinion as to the area at which the defendant or the shooter would have been standing when these shots were fired?
Yes, sir. There may have been movement on the part of the shooter, but depending on the position of both victims and the areas where they were impacted, he was probably standing positioned with one victim to either side of him or to either side of him slightly in front of him.
Would he have been standing, looking at the State's Exhibit 38, would he have been standing to the left of where the bodies are, up on the deck or down on the deck?
I can draw right on this.
Sure.
It will probably be somewhere in this area right in here. The reason we say that too is there was no movement of either victim that we can tell after the gunshots impacted their bodies. Both of the victims sustained very devastating gunshot wounds that would preclude them from moving afterwards. Both of them seem to have gone to the ground in an area right where they sustained the gunfire. And what else tells us that is there is no bloodstain evidence outside of the area that is located immediately around each victim. The bloodstain is right there. With that type of injury, multiple gunshot wounds, it is very common if the injured party is moving, whether walking, running, crawling, whatever it may be, that there will be additional bloodstain evidence deposited on other surfaces, and there is none. It's all right there in and around the victim.
So once they start to sustain injuries, the bloodstain analysis tells you that they did not walk around or slide around or have any other such movement.
Yes, sir. It's consistent with no movement.
So the shooter would have needed to have been in a position where he could, with each of them to their backs to the shooter,
Yes.
but close enough to have deposited gunshot residue on each of the victims.
That's yes. Yes, sir.
And close enough to Chris Kyle to have inflicted the type pattern of bullet wounds that you found in the autopsy.
In one scenario, yes.
Okay. Now you say one scenario, you have developed a couple of different scenarios of the possible order of shots for Chris Kyle. Could you address those?
Yes, sir. Specifically with Mr. Kyle, what we concluded was based on the blood stain evidence being located in one specific area and based on where his wounds were located, what you can see adjacent to his left arm on the ground there is what we call a saturation stain in that dirt. That's consistent with his body being moved over to administer first aid, but rolled over. You'll notice that between that saturation stain and his body, there is an area of dirt right in here where there is no additional blood. That's consistent with him being on his side or more towards his face, laying down in that dirt as the blood is released from his body. When they roll him, there's additional blood underneath his head, but there's no blood in between. So that's two separate positions, and it's logical to conclude that he was moved for medical intervention. With the position or the location and position of his wounds on his body, we had to say that it was probably one of two scenarios. One, he's standing up, he's not looking, he doesn't see this about to happen. And there's a number of factors that we use to conclude that as well, other than just the blood in the gun. But he's struck by gunfire. All of the gunfire is delivered in one episode or one event. That's one scenario. The other possible scenario is that he receives a portion of that gunfire, and it would have to be one of the two fatal gunshots, the one that struck the aorta or the one that struck his face and hit his spinal cord, that would have put him down to the ground, and then at some point additional gunfire was administered to the body on the ground. Either one of those two scenarios are plausible with what we have here.
So either rapid fire at close range that dropped him and all the shots were a single salvo, or a short salvo that completely incapacitated him with follow-up shots while he's on the ground.
Yeah, yes, sir. And you got to think about this. There's two individuals on that deck that he's engaging in gunfire. So at any given time, one of them, if given the opportunity, would engage him. You can't go through this particular investigation without acknowledging the fact that both individuals are armed and never had the chance to present that.
And that's because their weapons, you know that because their
Yes.
weapons were found in their holsters with the safeties on.
Yes, they were never unholstered. You also can't really look at this with a degree of objectivity without taking into consideration the skill set of Mr. Kyle. If he's faced with a confrontation, I have to believe that he's going to defend himself and engage. It's very obvious that he never saw it coming. He was shot in the face and the right side of his body, either all in one violent episode or in two. And those two scenarios, either he takes it all standing up and falls down, or he falls down and takes additional gunfire on the ground.
But either way, he didn't see it coming.
Never saw it coming.
Now, what does the empty revolver and the earplugs in his ear tell you as an analyst?
Well, that goes to what I was just saying about there's other factors here that had to be considered when we went through this. That pistol on the ground, that revolver, is empty. It's fired dry, meaning all the rounds had been discharged. You'd have to ask, and we did, I asked myself, when did this happen? When did the decision to engage them occur? And I don't think it's coincidental that the position of the shooter was in an area where he could engage two targets, either simultaneously or one and then the other in a very rapid succession. And the other thing is, he knew that there was some gunfire going down range at targets, and I don't think it's coincidental that he waited until that revolver was empty.
So the engagement occurred at a time of the shooter's choosing. Is that your opinion?
Absolutely. Yes, sir.
All right. So we layer upon layer, you've stated your opinion that these the relative position being the blue mark up there on the left of that states 38. That now, since you've been out to the range, it's hard to gauge distances from where we are looking at this photograph. About how close in feet would that be to each of the victims, Chris Kyle and Chad Littlefield?
Where I just put him there, it's probably, it's under 10 feet to each, maybe 6 to 7 feet, if that. It was, excuse me, it was actually a lot smaller space when I got to see that area than it looks in that photograph. They weren't far away at all.
So the tightness of the pattern tells you these were not long distance difficult shots.
No, they were not. I don't believe so.
Now, Chad Littlefield's situation was a little more complicated than the pattern of shooting that went up Chris Kyle. Could you explain what your findings were in relation to specifically Chad Littlefield?
Yes, sir. I don't view it as a complicated. I view it as very different. Mr. Littlefield, the wounds on his body are in different locations and on different sides of his body and on different parts of his body, whereas on Mr. Kyle, they were confined to a linear pattern on one side of the body. I do believe, as we mentioned earlier, that he was shot in the back first. One of those two projectiles that passed through his upper torso from back to front and exited his chest, I believe, were first. And the reason I say that is this. One hit his spinal cord and would have put him in a position of being incapacitated.
Now, is that correct? The two here to the back were first.
Yes.
Now, the wounds you talk about coming from different directions, could you describe those for us?
Yes, sir. I'm going to
Would it
use.
be helpful to step down and point?
Is that okay?
Maybe.
Yes, sir.
I'm going to use the numbers that are marked out here by the medical examiner. When I use these numbers, it doesn't mean I'm sequencing what happened first. I believe these two were first, or at least one of these was first. And the reason I say that is we can say with certainty that Mr. Littlefield at one point was on his knee or knees. One knee or both knees. And I'll explain why we think that with regards to the bloodstain evidence. The other shots here, I believe, came after these. This is why. Number 3, which enters the back of the head at a very sharp down angle, in a very shallow angle to the plane of the skull, passes through the musculature in the back of the neck and exits the neck just below behind the ear. And I believe that also re-engages the shoulder over here forward. So I'm going to give you number 3 and number 4 in one go. Pass through and re-enter the shoulder. The way that happens is, if the body's down on the knee, well, first of all, the sharp down angle of number 3 has to have occurred if that head was lower than the muzzle. It's got to be down. Don't seriously down or down low. So this is lower. It has to be lower than the muzzle. Just the angle of the impact tells us that. Marginal abrasion on the bullet wound, very pronounced, and it's a very steep angle. And this line here, you can see the muzzle would have had to here somewhere. So it passes through, I believe it re-engages into the shoulder. For that to occur, this shoulder would have had to be up, almost like you lean. That shoulder comes up as you lean to brace yourself on the floor if you're on a knee.
Yeah.
If you were to kneel, whether this knee is on the ground or whether just the one knee is on the ground, where that bullet passes through the head and anything, you probably have missed the shoulder, unless the shoulder is up. For me to brace myself, my shoulder has to elevate itself. And if you articulate the body in that manner, that flight path lines up with 3 to 4. Either way, thereafter, he's down on knee or both knees.
So that shot through the back of the head that exits the side and through the shoulder, that's not the same initial salvo as the two to the back.
No, sir. In addition, there's a substantial amount of blood exiting this wound here up on the neck, and there's some blood exiting the entrance and the exit of what is marked as number 4. If he's in that position, the blood blood is gonna fall down with gravity. It has to fall, liquid blood. And the volume of the liquid blood present is so much that it's not gonna hang onto a surface anymore. It's gonna drip or flow. So this started to come down. In one of the photos, you'll see he's got blood on the interior of his forearm that actually flows down to his arm. And the way it's going to flow this way is with gravity. So that arm is down here. That blood is coming out, and it's landing down here, and it's landing on his pant leg as he starts to move backwards.
Well, and while you're down here, let's look at what you're talking about here in State's Exhibit 43 or 46. Basically 46, you're talking about blood on the arm here.
Yes, sir.
There's no wound to that arm, right?
No, sir.
So that blood came from somewhere besides the arm.
Correct.
Okay, so that's what you're talking about. Gravity would have needed to fed that down the arm.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
So right here.
Sure.
Sure.
Yes.
Okay, if you could use the big screen and point out what you're talking about.
The blood specifically that I was speaking about on the arm, you can see right here. And as you can see these flow patterns, they're moving towards the hand. Well, that doesn't flow that way if the hand's out here. It can flow if the hand's here. But the chances are the blood's not going to fall onto the interior arm here. It's also not going to fall onto the leg. So you can't really look at one without looking at both of these. You'll notice there's a substantial lack of blood anywhere on this leg except for these 2 or 3 marks down here. But there's a large amount of blood deposited here. Whenever we talk about crimson, we try to teach people, look for what's there. And sometimes it's very easy to see what's there. And there's a laptop right in front of me, but it's right there. We always say to them, what's not there? When you're talking about blood stain evidence, it's very important to say what's not there. And what's not there is in this area right in here behind the knee. This is what we call a void. Well, if I got blood falling onto this leg, and I got it falling onto the lowest part of my leg, and it's flowing this way, from the back of my leg to the front of my leg, stands to reason that it has to be in this position. Okay? So the blood in and of itself on the arm is one thing. When combined with the blood on the leg and the wound from up here, 2 wounds, flowing down onto the leg, you'll see it hitting the leg, and you'll see it hitting the right leg and flowing this way. It's moving down this way. That's gravity. That's a large volume of blood and absorb it properly, but it's large enough where it's flowing down. It has to be in this leg. Now, what's not there? See where my pant leg is pinched in? It's hitting here, and it's hitting here. It can't get in there. That void is created because that leg is folded over. And ultimately, we also have what's called a contact transfer pattern. I don't know how to do this with this, but can you zoom on the arm? Okay, on the interior of that arm, you see the blood flow, and then you see this very noticeable line. And then you see faint coloration in there. That's the blood coming in contact, or the arm coming in contact, somebody's wiping that blood. And what that is pant. Because we have a corresponding contact transfer on the pant. So he's down, it touches here, and at some point, he's going backwards. And you'll see that mark where the arm with the blood and the other blood on the pant leg, down in here, and up in here by the pocket knife. As the body falls backwards, the arm brushes up against it and leaves that contact transfer, and he ultimately lands on his back.
So, is it your opinion that the initial shots to Chad Littlefield's back was he upright and standing?
I believe he was.
And but after those shots, he ends up on his
I believe
knee.
he goes on one knee or both knees. And at some point in there, he also sustains a gunshot wound to his left hand. Just like that. Sustains a gunshot wound right here. Passes out, comes out right in the inside of the hand. And you can see the hand right here. Substantial amount of blood on the hand. Now, what I just said about gravity. When you have that much of a volume of blood will flow. You notice that there's no blood. Again, what's there, what's not there. No blood up here. It's staying down towards the hand. So where's it going? It's going down. The hand is on the floor, or at some point comes in contact with the floor. And just out in front of his foot is the area I believe the hand touched the floor. He deposited the blood from the hand to the floor, and you can see 4 very distinct markings on the floor, which are consistent with a wipe or a swipe. Blood on the floor, finger passing through, and you see it's going backwards that way. You see at the back end of the blood stain right here? You see how it's thick right here on the front, but in the back end it almost feathers out, kind of like a paintbrush. When you get a lot of paint on it, you pass it across the surface. And now it's running out of paint, and all of a sudden, you gotta get more paint on the brush because it's not covering it well. Same thing right there. That hand is going backwards. That hand came in contact with that floor, bloody and wounded, and went backwards. The hand came off the floor right there as he falls back. So we have evidence of him on his knees and falling backwards on both sides of the door.
Well, in between the shots to the back and when he ends up on his back, and we have him on his knee or both knees, how do you have an opinion to address how it is that a shot was fired to the left side of his head that exited to the right side of his neck?
Are you referring to number 3?
Yes.
Well, there's several scenarios. I could have been completely forward, or he could have been on that knee, which we know he already is. Certainly he's on his knee at some point, and all the evidence is there to tell us he's on his knee. And he turns backwards with that hand on. Almost turned backwards to see a threat, engage a threat. He's already injured at this point, if this is the case. Turns backwards, the hand takes in the defensive position, takes a shot through the hand and sends it forward. At that point, you can take that shot right through the head. It will line up with the shirt, the shoulder, and everything while he's in this position. You can get shot while he's on his knees as well.
We have bullet wounds to Chad, number 1, that entered in the top of the head and exited the back of the head.
Yes, sir.
And we also have bullet wound number 2, which is inflicted upon Chad just to the left of his nose, below his eye, and exited from his back left shoulder.
Yes.
Based on everything that you've synthesized from the crime scene photos and the other experts, have you formulated an opinion as to when those wounds were inflicted?
Yes, sir. We came up, as you look at that, I came up with 2 scenarios. Both of those scenarios engage would have Mr. Littlefield down on the ground in one of 2 positions. The first one is he's on his knees, as I just showed you, with the shooter out in front of him. At that point, Mr. Littlefield would have to expose his face to the muzzle of the weapon. To do that would mean he would be looking right up at his shooter on his knees.
Now I'm going to put 356 up on the screen, Mr. Ryan. Now you prepared that drawing, right?
Correct.
And does that depict what you were just explaining to the jury?
Yes, sir. Under this particular scenario, like I just said, he would have to be almost showing his face or the front side of his body to the weapon. If that were to happen with the hard down angle of those shots, if he was on his knees, he would have taken one shot through the apex of his head, right through the top, and it would have exited right back here, right behind the head. The second one would have been just to the left side of his nose in his cheek. And it exited down by his shoulder. So it traveled downward and through the neck and out the back. Now, for that to have occurred, we would have the expectation of seeing other evidence. And what I mean is, both of these gunshots were perforating. By perforating, I mean passing through the body, entered and exited. When a gunshot perforates and comes out the other side, a lot of times it will take bone fragment, hair, tissue, and blood with it. A projectile's traveling at a very high velocity, but as it starts to hit, it slows down. They're also designed to deform and slow down. When they deform and slow down, that is designed that way. It's designed to release its kinetic energy. The problem is when it deforms, not the problem, but the design is when it deforms, it also does a substantial amount of tissue damage. As a result, what we would expect to see on both of those exit wounds is the projectile continuing on, maybe seeing a secondary impact mark if there was still enough energy in that projectile as it left the body to impact something.
You mean it hit something else on the outside?
Yes, sir. But more telling would be forward spatter. There's two types of evidence that you see specifically with blood that we look for with gunshot wounds. Back spatter, forward spatter. Back spatter, when the bullet hits a surface, it enters and blood will actually come back out. The analogy we always give is you jump into a swimming pool. The water displaces, the water comes back up. It's the exact same thing. The blood will come back out. But more pronounced than that is the forward spatter. As the projectile exits the body part, and quite honestly, regardless of the velocity that it exits, you'd still see some forward spatter. Now, if it's exiting with a lot of its energy still intact and speed, you can see a substantial amount. And if he's on his knee and he takes that gunshot through his face while he's on his knee, I would expect to see a substantial amount of forward spatter in the area often behind his final resting position.
Now, when you say forward spatter, that's in the, you mean forward in the direction of the bullet travel?
Correct. It would have came out this way and traveled, as you're looking at the screen, right to left on both of them.
Looking at going back to State's Exhibit 38, which is a sort of a zoomed out view, where would you, is in the scenario, do you have Chad facing to the right on his knees?
Yes.
Scenario A?
Yes, sir. This is where his the contact transfer of the hand would have been. And had he been up on his knees, I would have expected to see some forward spatter back in this area and maybe a corresponding defect mark where a bullet may have hit a floor or hit something else. On both of those gunshots, we found nothing. There was nothing back there.
So you did not find spatter over there to the left of Chad that we see now?
No, sir, we did not.
All right, so that, now, going back to your scenario A, which is as you described on the exhibit here on 356, this only depicts the head and shoulders. To get these angles like we have here from a shooter who is standing, and let's just assume we're talking about a shooter who is standing, haven't heard anything otherwise, what would have been the position of Chad's body to have taken these shots in this manner?
If he took it from the front, he would have to have been low on his knee or both knees, maybe slightly leaning forward for one or the other. Keep in mind, though, there's two shots there. If it were to happen in this position, one shot impacted the body, especially if it impacted his skull, it would have rocked him a little bit. He would have moved. There would have been movement and maybe exposed the face. So what I'm saying is the head's not going to be in exactly the same stationary position for the both shots. One is obviously going to make you move a little bit.
So even if the shots are fired twice, the first one's going to affect the position of
It should, yeah.
Now, did you come up, now you explained the weaknesses of this scenario, that being the lack, going back to State's Exhibit 38, that being the lack of blood spatter behind Chad's body.
Correct.
Now, did you come up with another scenario regarding those two shots to the face and to the top of the head, which you believe is more plausible?
Yes.
Could you explain that?
Well, as I previously explained, we're certain he was on a knee or both knees. We know that the hand touched the floor. We have him going backwards. Obviously, his final resting position is he's backwards, for one. And the other thing is we have the movement of already shed blood on his pants and his arm, and that contact transfer that shows us that while that liquid blood is present, there's that movement of him going backwards, ultimately falling to his back. From that point, the second scenario is that while he's on his back, face up or partially face up, he is shot in his face and through the top of his skull while laying flat on his back on the ground.
So that's after he's been shot twice in the back and dropped to his knee or knees,
And shot in the back of the head.
then shot in the back of the head, and we have his hand bleeding, his left hand bleeding on the deck,
Correct.
and then we have blood flowing from the exit wound on his right side of his neck down his arm and onto his pants leg.
Yes.
You see evidence that at some point, with his legs doubled under him, he rolled back onto his back.
At some point, he definitely rolled to his back. And the only question and difference between the scenarios is whether he was shot in the face while he was on his knee or whether he was shot in his face while he was on his back. But he was shot in his face at a very sharp down angle in relation to the head and back.
Mr. Ryan, now we've got State's Exhibit 357. This is the second scenario you just described.
Yes.
Now, comparing this to State's Exhibit 38, does that the State's Exhibit 357 depict the final resting place of Chad that we see depicted in the photograph, State's 38?
Yes, sir.
Now, from where on this State's 357, where would the shooter be standing in order to inflict these two wounds in this manner?
Somewhere back in this area right here.
Now, if we believe the bullets travel relatively straight through the face, through the shoulder, then through the top of the head to the back of the head, are these lines depicting the trajectory that those bullets would have been shot from?
Yes, those lines depict the flight path of the bullet before it impacted the body. Excuse me.
So if I, as a guy who's 5'11", I'm holding a pistol, could you sort of position me in this drawing until I intersect with one of these lines and determine that's where I was standing?
You could, yes. Yes, you could, depending on the position of your body. Again, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Now, assuming we're dealing with a shooter who's standing up, it's clear he didn't lean down and shoot him like this, down low, right?
Well, that could have happened. If he was that close, though, I would expect to see a substantial amount of gunshot residue pattern we didn't see there. So I think it was a little bit further back.
Okay. So you didn't see evidence that the gun was placed at the top of the head and fired?
Did not.
It was shot from further back,
I believe so.
but not real far back because this line goes up.
Correct.
Infinity.
Yeah, there comes a point if you follow that line back out into space where it's just not possible for the gun would be held up in the air, and and eventually it will become impossible. He can't reach. So it's going to be within an area where that individual or that specific height, depending on the position they were standing, whether it was a comfortable stance, whether it was low, but in that flight path right there.
Now, Mr. Ryan, you have said that you believe this scenario is more plausible.
I do.
Could you explain to the jury why you think this scenario of being shot while he's on his back is more plausible than the scenario depicted in States 356?
Yes, sir. From the beginning of the injuries sustained by Mr. Littlefield to this point, we believe there's only one scenario. The shot to the back sends him to his knees. He suffers those other shots. And at that point when on the knees, there's a potential divergence. It's one or the other. The reason I think this particular scenario is more plausible is, one, the lack of evidence you saw in scenario A, the forward spatter or anything else behind him that we would expect to see. The other thing here is, at the shot that went through his face, bless you, the shot that went through his face, passed down through the neck and exited the area inside his shoulder, between his backbone and his shoulder. The projectile was there. In other words, it was a perforating gunshot. It passed through the entire body from front to back, but the projectile was there. It was present. And that is something that we call can be called a short exit wound. Sometimes it'll show very specific signs of a short exit wound. And what we mean is, if the body or the surface portion of the body where the bullet is going to exit is up against another surface, standing against a wall, laying on the floor. It could be something as believe it or not, as simple as a belt being tight around the body. If the bullet actually passes through and hits that item, sometimes it has decelerated enough and lost enough energy that when it hits that firm surface, which is in firm contact with the body, it will exit and stay right there. When Mr. Littlefield was moved, that projectile was right next to that exit wound. And it's very consistent with a short exit wound, which also is a very strong indicator that he was in that position when that bullet went through his face.
And any, what we would call blood spatter would be confined to that area underneath the body.
Yes, and after, as time went by, minutes go by, the head contains a large amount of blood, and the head will bleed. Even if the body is deceased, the blood will drain if the exit wound is in a place where it's low and it affords itself to drain. All of that forward spatter that would be expected even with the body in this position is not going to show itself. It's not going to be there. One, because the body is up against that shored surface, and two, because the draining of the head and the blood coming out of him at that point is going to pool and have this larger stain, and it will eventually overtake any other visible bloodstain evidence that may have been there. So that's why we don't see it, and that's why I'm inclined to believe that's the position he was in when the two shots passed through one through his face and one through the top of his head.
So based on finding the projectile and the blood stain patterns that you saw, is it your opinion this was in the position Chad Littlefield was in when he took those final two shots?
Yes, sir.
Wounds, in order to determine the likely trajectory.
Yes, sir. Sometimes we use, excuse me, articulating mannequins as a illustrative tool to show the flight path. And what we do is we put the points of impact and the points of exit on the mannequin as it's described by the medical examiner.
Now, did you do so in connection with those two head wounds of Chad Littlefield, which are depicted in State's Exhibit 357?
Yes, sir.
And I mean, right here in front of us, we have covered up a mannequin. Is that a mannequin you prepared?
Yes, sir, it is.
And have you made it such that this articulating mannequin matches up with the final resting position of Chad Littlefield as depicted at the crime scene?
Yes, sir.
Your Honor, may we utilize the mannequin?
You may.
May the witness step down.
Yes, sir.
Now, Mr. Ryan, could you, if you want to, now that I've pulled this thing off, could you make sure it's in the position that it needs to be in?
Yes, sir. It's a foam core mannequin.
Mr. Nash, make it that way a little bit. Those folks.
Okay. May the jury stand up, but we've tried to find a position for every seat, and it's almost impossible.
Yeah, if you can.
If we move it this way, then they can't see it, so. Okay. All right, Mr. Ryan, could you explain what you've done to prepare this articulating mannequin?
So as I was saying, it's a particular mannequin, it's a foam core mannequin. We use it for illustrative purposes only. What we've done is we've created a body position similar to the position the victim, Mr. Littlefield, was found in on that deck at the gun range.
On that issue, we'll show you states 43, which we discussed earlier.
Yes, sir.
Do you believe this appropriately approximates the position?
Yes, sir, with the exception of the arm over there, which doesn't seem to want to stay up in place and make sure the mannequin wants to swing the arm backwards. But really what we used this mannequin for was to depict the body flat or close to flat on its back, and specifically the two shots that were sustained to the head.
You're going to focus 43 for comparison purposes?
You may.
Okay, continue explaining how you've been prepared. After you approximated the positioning of the mannequin, could you explain what else you did prepare this?
Yeah, so what I'm saying is, for this particular item here is illustrated purposes only. And what we do is, we identify the areas that were impacted by the projectile and where the projectile exited based on the report that was forwarded by the medical examiner. So then what we do is we place the flight path rods in place, perforating the mannequin to the entry and exits as given to us by the medical examiner. And what we try to do is place the body in the best position that we can to reasonably be similar to what you see up there on the screen of the actual crime scene photo. See the head is slightly canted to the left. The thing that's important to remember is with any body, the body as a whole articulates parts of the body, a hand, an arm, a head, a neck. So to find the exact position the head may have been rotated, we can put the flight path rod in place, but one to the other, the head can be slightly two different positions as each shot is delivered.
So one shot, whichever one of these two shots was first, would have affected the position of the head
It may
and
have-
be in a line for the second shot.
That's right, it may have, yes. It's important to go back to what we were saying earlier to get him in this position. We already had 2 perforating gunshot wounds to the torso, where he was shot in the back. We have another one in the back of the head, through the shoulder, which caused all that blood that enabled us to get him to this position, to say to him that he was in this position. And then we have these 2 shots, and that short exit wound, which I'm going to point to the flight path rod that depicts the gunshot wound to the face. That projectile is located beneath the victim's shoulder.
Now, on that point, did it be found beneath the victim? I mean, it still would have been traveling with some velocity when it exited the victim's body, would it not?
Yes, sir.
So what, you've been out to that range. What is the decking made of that would have stopped that projectile?
I'm not sure what the brand is, but it's a composite decking. It's kind of strange, but I have that exact decking in my house. It's a gray colored decking, and it's made with a composition of plastic and wood. It's very resilient. It's very flexible. It's designed actually to hold more body weight. The supports further apart. But if the bullet struck right here, passed through, and decelerated enough, when it strikes that decking is more than sufficient to stop that bullet at that point. But every shot is different. So we can never say that that's always going to happen. But in this particular shot, it hung right up in his clothing. But it hit that object that was behind the body, creating that short exit.
And that's one of the reasons you believe this is a more plausible position, because if he'd been upright or kneeling on his knees like this, would you believe that projectile would have gone on through his clothing and landed on the deck somewhere?
Well, the bullet, that's an excellent question. The bullet actually did go through the clothing. There was the hole in the clothing. So if he was upright and he created that hole in the clothing, it would have been gone. Or even if it decelerated, it would have been behind him. But it did break the clothing and stayed there, which is really telling us that he's in this position. It's right against that hard floor when that shot is administered. Now, with respect to the gunshot through the top of the head, there's 2 things that are possible at this point in this engagement. The shooter is positioned in an area right here, standing looking over the victim on the ground. And I say there's 2 possibilities right here. Mr. Littlefield is either already deceased or he's in distress. But either way, he's defenseless. He's in a defenseless position on the floor. And at some point, the muzzle of the weapon that fired these 2 rounds is positioned slightly behind and over top of his head and discharged twice into his head. This particular one right here that exits the back of the head, if it's coming more at this angle, there's a possibility that it passes through, which it did, struck the deck and ricocheted, and it is possible it wouldn't even work. That would probably be the case where the head might have been slightly off the deck if that were to happen. We would have seen more of a short exit, or we would have seen some evidence of a short exit going to the back since we didn't see it. So I'm more inclined to believe that he was not deceased at this point. He was in distress when that shot through his head.
So his head likely was lifted off the decking at that point.
Or turned slightly to the side. One of those two. But we had no real identifiable corresponding defect mark, and we had no forward spatter out to the side from the exit wound, like I described before, that forward spatter. So I believe it may have been slightly off the deck, and that leads me to again believe that, at least for this particular shot, he probably was not deceased. Either one of those two shots have been identified as being.
Now, we see that the rods here are offset in direction to some degree. How would you explain that if the shooter, and this is a big assumption, I grant it, if the shooter were standing in a single position, why would those two shots come from different trajectories relative to the head?
Well, it's important to remember that a shooter can be stationary, meaning his feet planted on the ground, but the gun may move. The weapon in the hand may move. The other option is he's standing, well, there's two. He could be standing still and firing two shots, and the head could move. And the head may move as a result of the impact of the projectile to the skull, or it may move because the individual is not yet deceased and he has movement. Or it could be that the shooter with a weapon. So there's variables, but there's very minimal movement. I mean, this is not far. When you look at this coming back, this particular shot here to the face, look where this flight path comes back. It's almost as if the muzzle is right over top of his face.
Would you expect, you described earlier, you have forwards spatter, which is in the direction of the bullet passing through.
Yes.
Would you expect some spatter to come from that entrance wound toward the shooter?
That could happen, yes.
And with this being the source of the blood being at a low point, would you expect that to get high, or would you expect it to?
Well, that all depends on how far away the target surface of the blood may land on. It's not going to travel very far with that amount of energy release. Back spatter from a handgun may travel back several feet, but what's going to happen is going to have a parabolic effect. It may come back out of that wound and may have enough energy to come up. As soon as it starts to lose energy, it's going to curve and drop down. So if there was back spatter that came out on anything, it's not very far away from it. It's going to be close.
And you wouldn't expect it to hit something very high.
No, if you were standing on top of it, maybe it'd be higher. But as the further you get away, when I say the further, a foot or two is going to make a huge difference. The parabolic effect is going to take place, and it's probably going to fall more towards as you're standing there. I'd say your pant legs or your shoes or something like that.
I'll pass the witness.
All right, you may be seated and you may return to your seat.
Mr. Ryan, I understand from your testimony that the position of the victim, the shooter, the variables, you've come up with a theory for some plausible scenarios, correct?
Yes.
And tell this jury what, if anything, that tells us about the state of the mind of the defendant at the time of the shooting.
Sir, I don't know that any specific piece of physical evidence.
Does it tell us anything about the state of the mind of the defendant at the time of the shooting?
I can tell you it doesn't tell me anything other than,
That's
let
fine.
me ask you.
No, that's fine. I pass the witness. Nothing further, Your Honor.
All right, you may step down.
Seems like deja vu all over again for you, isn't it?
That's fine.
Chief, you already testified previously about the jail call recording and preservation system at the county jail,
Yes, sir, that's correct.
and that's still the case.
Okay.
Did you have occasion to assist us in retrieving a couple more calls made by the defendant in connection with which include information relating to this case?
Yes, sir.
Press 1 para español o prima 2. Or enter the area. At the tone, say your name.
Eddie Ralph.
Please wait while I connect your call. Your party has answered. Please hold for billing acceptance. Hello? Hello, this is an Infinity operator calling from. All phone calls are subject to monitoring and recording. You have $7.34. Hello?
Hey. I don't know, like this thing, some kind of pig show or some shit, I don't know, it's just a big show, or Moss Hog, it's a coach. Hey, these people are, I guess they're down like Grossback, they're in Texas somewhere, I guess Grossback area. And they're, you know, trapping and shooting hogs and stuff, and they got a barbecue day. Partnered up with this black woman and, this other black dude to cook barbecue or whatever, cook pigs. They're the black chicken, the black cook went out with the old man to go get a pig out of the trap. And they were like, no. They didn't want to have nothing to do with it. And she's like, no way, that's where it comes from. He's like, yeah, this is where your meat comes from, for your food at the barbecue joint. Oh my gosh. And then they butchered it up and everything. And cleaned it, she was freaking.
I don't think where Grossbeck is. I think it's kind of down south.
Yes, I don't know, I don't know what relation it is to here, but
Yeah.
I guess
I
he's
think
here.
it's like on the way to these
So he's
bands, I think.
It ain't that far, it's only about an hour away from Midlothian.
Hmm.
Now, just to be clear, Chief, that State's Exhibit 358, that call we just listened to, was made on April 11th, 2014,
That is correct. Yes, sir.
and that's what we've called the Boss Hog call.
Yes, sir.
Now, may I publish State's Exhibit 359, Your Honor? Now, this call is actually done about 10 and a half months before that Boss Hog call, right?
That would be correct.
May 31st, 2013.
Yes, sir.
That's after the defendant's been in the jail about 4 months.
That would be right.
The charges for this call will be an operator service charge of $1.25 plus an additional 50 cents for the first minute and 50 cents for each additional minute. Hello, this is a call at no expense to you from an inmate at the Erie County Jail. This call will be recorded and subject to monitoring at any time. To accept this call, dial 3. To receive this call, dial 9 or hang up now. Thank you for using Infinity Networks. You may begin speaking now.
Now, one question before we continue publishing this. Is this a call to the New Yorker reporter?
Yes, sir. It is.
Hello? Hello? Hey. Hey, Eddie. How you doing, man? I'm doing all right. Yourself? Well, you know, it's morning here in Texas. I figured I'd wait till 8 until the sun came up good and bright on my ass, you know. How long you going to wait? It's good. It's been going good. You know, I've just been hanging out this morning. You know, I got up early and came across the concrete. Got me, you know, warm cup of water and drank that for breakfast, and then, you know, read some letters and stuff like that.
Are you aware that the article came out on Monday?
Did it really?
Yeah, so we just put an issue in the mail to you.
Nice.
You should be getting it maybe today or tomorrow.
I'm excited to read it.
Yeah. I think your mom and dad and Laura were all very, very helpful, and Jen was all very, very helpful. Do you think about that day?
Did I think about that during the day?
Do you think about that day in February? Is that something that
I do, it tore my fucking heart out when I did it. I don't know why I did it, but I did it. I feel so shitty about it. I guess you live and you learn,
what can I ask you? In February, when you met Chris and Chad, what did you all talk about that morning?
They didn't talk too much to me. They were real quiet. They weren't answering me for a reason, I guess.
But so
I didn't even know Chad was Chad. I didn't even know his first name. All I knew he was Little Phil. And Kyle.
Well, they picked you up at your house, right? And you all drove from there to Rough Creek?
They did.
And so in that whole car ride, y'all didn't really talk about anything?
Well, I tried to, they just they kind of answered me, they give me like a half-ass answer. And then, I think we were in Midlothian. Mr. Kyle was trying to hand me his cell phone. He said my girlfriend was calling. Well, I broke up with her that morning. Why is this bitch trying to call me again? I told her to get the fuck out. She was already reluctant to leave. Well, hey, get the fuck out.
Why'd y'all break up?
Well, I stayed up all night that night, and I don't know why I wanted to tell her to kick rocks that day, but I told her to kick fucking rocks. Well, when you say kick rocks, you know what I mean? We got river rocks in my driveway in Lancaster,
But you had proposed to marry her the day before, right?
Well, things change, just like that overnight, you can change.
So, sorry, we're getting back to that day though. So Jen called on Chris Kyle's phone?
Yes, sir.
And she must have gotten the number from your mom, I guess, yeah?
Well, it was on the freezer. So I guess she obviously remembered it.
And when
I can't remember it.
That was on the drive, so that was if you all were just leaving?
Yeah, that was when we were heading to the ranch. She tried to call, and I said, fuck that, I don't want to talk to her. I already stated my facts that morning, Told her how it was. I got up early. I got up fucking early now. It was, I don't know, 4 in the morning or so. And, maybe even earlier than that. Started some coffee. Cooked myself a sandwich. Made a, bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich. And I asked her if she wanted anything to eat. She was like, no, I'm good. She still ate a piece of bacon, I guess that's how you earn your bacon, Turn that fat back. That's what they call it. It's really on the belly. But you know where it comes from.
So as you all were driving after she called, then you didn't talk much the rest of the way, or you did a little bit?
Well, they just didn't want to talk, We stopped at Whataburger and got us a bite to eat. And, I thought that was strange, I didn't tell them I was hungry. They just pretty much force fed me. I guess they didn't force feed me. I still ate, but I didn't ask them to eat. They just went through the drive-thru and pulled up to the first window, and I told them, aren't you tired of eating all this other stuff and all this shit, all the shit everybody else is eating? And they're like, well, yeah. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know about you, but you know, you get tired of eating the same old shit day after day. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What you know the Army and the Marine Corps have been fighting it out for fucking years now. Mm.
So y'all kept driving and got to the gun range, and then what happened there?
We got out and Chris, he would shoot the 45, and you know, he handed me a 45. Well, okay, he handed me it was a Navy. I'm pretty sure it was a single action. Mm-hmm. And, you know, or no, I guess it's called Army. You know, go Army. Mm-hmm. And, the Army, you know, he handed it up to me and I set it down and I was like, nah, it's all right. Well, I picked up a 9mm, started loading the mag, I filled the mag, shot a magazine. He shot a magazine. Oh, okay. So we're shooting pistols here, huh? Mm-hmm. Okay. I guess that's pretty much saying duel, motherfucker, you know? So I loaded up another magazine. It was the smell in the air that morning, you know? It smelled like shit. Mm. And, yeah, that's when I had to take care of business, and then I took care of business, and then, I got in the truck and left, and, was fucked up, you know? Got back in the truck, put in a fucking deal, started heading north on 67, and, stopped at the Dollar General, trying to buy it was a Dr. Pepper, and then the line was out the ass, and I was like, fuck this. So I threw the Dr. Pepper down and all ass. And I got to Alvarado to my Uncle Jamie. Mm-hmm. Or James, I guess you'd say, Uncle James. Mm-hmm. And then, you know, got sick. I remember the Mexicans next door, they just got back from the grocery store and they're carrying in some groceries. And,
So do you still have 9mm with you at this point?
I did.
And so you all were both at the range and both shooting at targets not how far away?
I was at 25. I think it was at 50.
And you just then did he say something to you or did you just turn? I mean what sparked?
What sparked it was I kept looking at Littlefield. I was like, what the fuck are you even doing here, man? I asked him a couple times, I go, hey, you gonna shoot? You gonna shoot? You gonna shoot? You gonna shoot? He's like, no, I'm good. What are you doing? It's a spectator sport. It's a shooting sport. You shoot. And that's what got me all, you know, wired up. And I was like, this motherfucker, all he's doing is watching. He watched it.
Did you shot Chris first?
No, I didn't shoot Chris first. I shot him second.
And did Chris fire at you as well?
Oh, he was shooting right beside me, you know.
Yeah, did he? So you're standing there and you shot Littlefield and then you turned and shot Chris.
Yes, sir.
And did Chris, after you shot Littlefield, did Chris try and come after you or shoot you or anything?
Well, you know, it was like I started shooting, and he was just finishing a magazine. He just finished it, last shell. Jumped right out of the gun. I guess that's how you dropped the 45, you know.
So he was shooting the 45, yeah?
Yeah, he's shooting 45. 45.
And
I guess I really should have picked up the 45, you know. They work better. They got more weight.
Did you, on the ride there that day, did you feel like, you came back and you said something to Laura, I think, that you couldn't trust them, and so, you had to kill them before they killed you.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's how I felt that day, That's how I was feeling.
And, you felt that way from the time, almost from the time they picked you up, that whole car ride, that's how you felt?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, there was other times. It smelled like cologne, It smelled like sweet cologne, and then it'd go being sour like a motherfucker, I guess it was love and hate, It's smelling love and hate. They were giving me some love and hate. You can smell it when it's in the air, I mean, don't you smell it? You're out there on the East Coast.
What's in there, though? Well, I don't know how that relates to what was, you were smelling that. Can you smell that when you were in the truck with Chad and Chris?
Yeah. I guess it really wasn't, I guess I was smelling myself, really. I was riding in the back seat.
You went from your uncle's house, you went to Laura's house, and then from there, where did you go?
So, hey man, I went to the house
Chief, that call we just heard, Exhibit 359, that was May the 31st, 2013.
Yes, sir.
To Nicholas Spell, the New Yorker report.
That is correct.
Pass the witness.
No questions.
Or 2 minutes, step down.
May I proceed, Judge? Just for the record, once again, state your name.
Mitchell Dunn, MD.
And are you the same Dr. Dunn that testified last week in this case?
Yes, I am.
Let me ask you, you were present during testimony last week when Dr. Ramula testified from San Antonio, who is in the audience today, and I think also Dr. Price, who testified last week. Is that correct?
Yes, I was.
And they had each, well, Dr. Price is a psychologist and Ramula is a physician. Is that right?
Yes.
Judge, bear with me. My sinuses are killing me today. And you heard each man's, I guess, for lack of better words, diagnosis of what they think is wrong with Eddie Routh.
Yes, I did.
And your position is different than their position, correct?
Yes, it is.
So what the jury has to figure out is we have 3 different experts testifying to 3 different opinions in terms of their evaluation of my client who's on trial for killing Chris Kyle and Chad Littlefield. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
And I ask you to go back and look at the records carefully like you did in the past, the hospital records, and look at each diagnosis from Dr. Price and Dr. Ramula, and then come back and testify to some issues of rebuttal to challenge their position. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the first thing I ask you to do is, would you, just so the jury can have a definition once again of what schizophrenia is, what is schizophrenia?
Schizophrenia is a mental disorder that's characterized by some disorder in thinking, usually in terms of perception of reality. And it's an illness that's not caused by an intoxicating substance. You'd have to rule that out. And that is characterized by a number of different symptoms. You have to have at least 2 of 5 possible symptoms to make a diagnosis of schizophrenia. Hallucinations would be one. We talked about that before. It'd be these false sensory perceptions. Delusions or fixed false beliefs. Disorganized speech or disorganized behavior, 2 other types of symptoms. And then the fifth would be the negative symptoms that we've talked about, the kind of flat affect, the avolition or kind of lack of motivation, the general social withdrawal. Those are the 5 possible symptoms that we look at in terms of making a diagnosis of schizophrenia.
And how would one make a diagnosis for Dr. Remla's diagnosis is mood disorder? How would you make that diagnosis? How would you know someone has a mood disorder?
Well, there's so many different mood disorders. The most common being major depressive disorder and bipolar disorder. And there are certain diagnostic criteria that we look at in terms of making that diagnosis. If it's major depressive disorder, there are 9 different diagnostic criteria. You have to have 5 of those. If it's a bipolar disorder, then we're looking at whether somebody's also had a manic symptom or manic episode, and there's 4 of 7 diagnostic criteria. I believe that's the number. Don't hold me to that. But you have to meet diagnostic criteria in that regard. And then if you think it's a mood disorder secondary to some intoxicating substance, then there has to be the temporal relationship between the intoxication and that mood disorder. You can also have a mood disorder secondary to a head injury, for instance. So there could be a lot of different potential causes, or it could be secondary to some medication that was prescribed for you, and it could cause that type of problem.
Do the medical records, which when Mr. Routh went to different mental health hospitals, either the VA or Green Oaks or other hospitals, does a scientist deals, I guess a scientist in your field deals in behavioral sciences based on someone's thought process, but also deals in actual science. Is that fair to say?
Well, we're not talking about basic sciences. It's obviously a mental health issue.
More advanced science, mental health sciences. My point of my question is, does the evidence in the medical records support Mr. Routh having a mood disorder?
It's my opinion that a mood disorder is not the diagnosis that Mr. Routh has suffered from. Certainly there were times that the medical records indicated that he had some symptoms of a mood disorder, and oftentimes that was a rule-out diagnosis as well. But it's my opinion that the most likely diagnosis is schizophrenia.
Now, regarding the antipsychotic medication, Dr. Remla indicates, and he testified under oath, that he believes the medication that Mr. Routh was taking was for mood disorder, and you disagree with that. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And help the jury understand why you disagree with that and how someone's dosage might start at a smaller amount but increase over a certain period of time.
Certainly.
Go ahead.
I understand why Dr. Rambula said that the Risperdal was for mood disorder, because actually the VA records indicated that in the text. But each time that he was at the VA, he was diagnosed, if you remember, with both a mood disorder and a psychotic disorder, or one time it was a major depressive disorder with psychotic features. So he was always diagnosed both with the mood issue and with the problems with psychosis. And each time he was discharged on a separate mood stabilizing medication, Depakote. So if the Risperdal was just for a mood disorder, there would have not been a reason to give him an antipsychotic medication. He was already on a medicine for a mood disorder, that Depakote. Dr. Ramey also indicated that he was given a dosage that was 1 milligram twice a day, which is a dosage that's normally given simply for a mood disorder, not for psychosis. But that's simply not correct. When the studies were done with Risperdal for mood disorder, for bipolar disorder, the dosing was always, in those studies, 4 to 6 milligrams, except for on one occasion, they started with 3 and then could go up. But there's also no difference in the dosing that is used for mood disorder versus psychotic disorder with Risperdal. So the idea that a lower dosage simply indicates that it's for a mood disorder, not for psychosis, is not accurate. A lot of doctors will start at lower dosages, such as 1 milligram twice daily, as Mr. Routh was on before, an increase in dosage. And that's simply to see if somebody responds at a lower dosage, or to try to decrease the risk of side effects, and then dosage might be increased according to the symptoms that they're having. But the idea that you would delineate a mood disorder versus psychotic disorder secondary to the dosage of Risperdal is not consistent with what I normally see in clinical practice.
So there's no reason for a physician to give those two separate medications if the person just has mood disorder. Is that right?
Well, they can be given, but it's not common unless somebody's still having significant and marked mood symptoms, for instance, continued mania, then you might add one of those agents. But if you look at the clinical record, the problem that he was there in the hospital for was not that he was, speaking 1,000 miles an hour and he was euphoric or that he was markedly depressed. One time he did go in because of the suicidal threats, but the clinical records would indicate that the symptoms that the people were most worried about was this disorganized thinking and the paranoid delusional thinking. And sometimes there were some mood symptoms mixed in with that. So unless there was, continued marked manic symptoms, one wouldn't expect to add on an antipsychotic agent if there wasn't also psychosis.
Now, what is a delusion specifically?
Well, you've heard this definition before. Delusion is a fixed false belief.
And I think we had examples last week of what that is, but give us one idea of a fixed false belief.
If I believe that I'm president of the United States and you tell me, no, we have a president, and here he is in the newspaper, and I say, well, I'm sorry, that's the false president, I'm actually the president, then I've been confronted with, evidence to the contrary, and I still hold that belief with the same strength that I had before.
And Dr. Ramler's position is that patients that have delusions only have, let me start over. A patient usually only has one delusion, less frequently two, and most three. Is that a fair assessment of someone that's schizophrenic or has delusions?
Yeah, Dr. Ramler did testify that usually people only have one delusion, certainly no more than three. And I'm simply not familiar with that concept. That's nothing I ever heard before in terms of either my training or what I've taught. I've been board certified in psychiatry and then had to be recertified twice, most recently last year. I've never heard of that concept. And I can tell you that at the state hospital where I deal with people with schizophrenia all the time, we don't count their number of delusions. I have a number of people in the hospital with, more than 3 delusions, and we don't say, oh, it's more than 3, you don't have a delusion or you don't have schizophrenia. Frequently they do have 1 or 2 main delusions, but they may have several more than that, and that's certainly, not consistent with what I've heard before about mental illness or about schizophrenia.
An example would be his delusion about his neighbor being in the Mexican mafia. Would that be a delusion?
Yes, if he believed that his neighbor was in the Mexican mafia and, despite contrary evidence, he's continued to believe that would be a delusion.
And his co-workers at the cabinet shop being cannibals, would that be a delusion?
Yes, if he believed that. Now, nobody really confronted him with evidence to the contrary, but if he believed that, despite evidence to the contrary, that would be a delusion.
And he had a belief the night before the knife-wielding incident, his statements to his girlfriend about being a demon and a crack whore, would that be a delusion?
Right. If he believed his girlfriend was actually a demon and a crack whore, then that would be a delusion.
What about Dr. Emley's basic feeling that, I guess to say Eddie's feelings were scattered and moving around meant that he had a mood disorder. Would that be inconsistent with someone who was otherwise schizophrenic in terms of that behavior?
Well, a mood disorder doesn't mean necessarily that your feelings are scattered and moving around. When I looked at the interview, it seemed to me that Mr. Ralph's thoughts were scattered and moving around, that there wasn't really a whole lot of feeling that was in there. It was, pretty flat in terms of affect. So I just didn't think that was an actual accurate representation of what we were seeing in the videos that we saw.
Now, Dr. Emley kept saying that if he's intoxicated, the game's over. Just as a matter of fact, like, hey, that's it. That's just the way it is. Tell me how you feel about that. What was your evaluation of that specifically?
Well, Dr. Rambula is right in that if somebody is having their mental illness simply secondary to voluntary intoxication, then you can't end up pursuing the not guilty by reason of insanity plea. But just because somebody's intoxicated doesn't mean that the game is over. If the mental illness is not secondary to that intoxication, if somebody's been drinking, yet they have significant psychotic symptoms that would qualify them for the not guilty by reason of insanity plea, the game is on. It's not that the game is over. And so if you're saying because of my intoxication, that's why I have this mental state, that's why I have the psychosis, then I would agree with him. But you don't stop just because somebody's intoxicated. You then, evaluate whether that intoxication was what was caused that mental state. I don't believe Mr. Routh was actually intoxicated at the time of the offense based on a lot of things that he did, shooting tragically but accurately at the victims, driving 105 miles. After that, not having an accident or anything, and not having slurred speech or other kinds of things that we associate with intoxication. But even if he was, that doesn't mean the game is over unless that intoxication actually caused that mental state.
And I think Dr. Emmett stated, everything comes from the brain as actions speak louder than words. Express your professional opinion about that.
Well, I mean, actions are important, obviously, but words are important too. I mean, we're psychiatrists, so we evaluate people on what they're saying. What they're saying usually indicates what they're thinking. And I believe what's more important was during that interview with Officer Briley, he wasn't able to put his thoughts together. He was really all over the place, and his thinking, was quite scattered. His if he was trying to put together or get a message across, he wasn't doing a very good job at all. And so I think the words are important. That's how we go about evaluating people.
And basically, also, Dr. Emlet testified that the interview that my client gave with Ranger Briley was basically a red herring. It was inconsistent with any mental illness. What's your position on that?
I thought that interview with Ranger Briley was really the best kind of real-time evidence that we had regarding his mental state at the time. There was an hour or so of interview, and then you got to kind of watch him beforehand, a little bit afterward. And to me, that wasn't the red herring. That was what showed the way his mental state actually was. And I can tell you this, as much time as I've spent with people with schizophrenia, I couldn't have done what Eddie Routh did if I was trying to fake mental illness, if I was trying to purposefully get something across. The capacity to, answer those questions in such an unusual manner, I couldn't have done unless I was reading off some type of script, because he really, was asked a question, and then sometimes the very beginning of it might be in response to the question, but then he kind of went off in another way entirely, off on tangents. And people who are able to think clearly, I don't think they can replicate that at all. So to me, that was the very character of mental illness there. That wasn't a red herring. That was Eddie Routh in his state on that day.
The jury heard the video and heard the audio and saw the video. Could you, just for the juries to refresh their memory, what did Eddie Routh, in that crazy state of being psychotic and schizophrenic, say to Ranger Briley specifically? Some of the things he said. Do you have that in front of you?
I have a transcript here.
Could you just, not all of it, just read specifically what he said so the jury can recall in their mind how he was acting that day?
Well, if you remember, Dr. Rambula had said that he thought that Mr. Routh was kind of setting up a possible insanity defense, because when he was back of the police car, he said something about, I've been paranoid and schizophrenic all day. Am I going to the insane asylum? And then he's in custody of the police, and he goes to the Lancaster police station. He's waiting. We watch him there, waiting. He's got his head down on the table, and he's kind of walking around. And if that was the case, and I would think during that time he would really be putting together the opportunity to, really present his idea, to say, officer, I'm really crazy, and this is what I was thinking. But instead, the officer walks in. The very first thing that Mr. Routh says, and I'm quoting here, "Everybody knows there are right things to do. You know what I mean? The right thing and the wrong things to do in the world. There are certain things you got to start doing. seriously, I just hope my mom and dad aren't too late. Why is this world, why didn't we see it coming before? So that's not the message of a guy that's trying to set up an insanity defense. That's the guy who's just kind of talking about what's on his mind. And then the officer says to him, we'll have to talk to these guys about doing that stuff. After he asks about getting the handcuffs off, he responds, me too. I'm trying to find out more about the world that I've been living into. I never knew I was in this deep. When I was looking at those computer screens, when I was in Iraq, I never thought I was. I mean, you look at those computer screens, doesn't make sense to you at the time, then you realize what's happening, you know, it's like astonishing, you know. So here's his opportunity to kind of present his case, and he's not making a whole lot of sense. He's talking about something about the computer screens that made sense to him, but doesn't make sense to us. And that's the character of schizophrenia. That is the disorganized thinking that you heard me testify about last week. And I think the evidence is here throughout. I'm not going to necessarily quote everything, but if he was setting up the insanity defense, I think you would have heard that. I don't think he's smart enough to know that the character of mental illness is disorganized thinking. I mean, most people, they're going to say, officer, I was hearing the voices telling me to do such a thing. We didn't hear that from Mr. Routh. We heard this.
And based on your practice, I mean, you are a person who actually sees real patients in real hospitals. Is that correct?
Yes.
Not to go anything that's privileged, how many patients do you see on a weekly basis?
I have 30 on my unit, and I do consultations, maybe 5 or 10 more, so 40. And then in my private practice, I might see 8 to 12 on Fridays.
How many, not to disclose anything that's medically privileged, how many folks do you treat with schizophrenia on a weekly basis?
Probably 2/3 of those people have either schizophrenia or something we call schizoaffective disorder. So, 20 to 30.
How many folks do you treat on a daily basis with a drug-induced psychosis?
We don't have any.
How many folks do you treat in the hospital with a mood disorder?
Maybe on a weekly basis, maybe 5 to 10.
Now, Dr. Rimley talked about did Routh change the description of the killings from killed when he spoke to his uncle to murdered when he spoke to his sister. Does that carry any weight at all?
Not for me. I don't think so. I think he's just using 2 different words that he thinks mean the same thing.
Ultimately, he said he had to take 2 souls before they took his soul, correct?
Correct.
And there's some implication that religion and other stuff like that. Do you, based on your evaluation, Mr. Routh, and looking at the records and looking at all the investigation, do you believe he means soul meaning that person, or is that some analogy he's given to taking someone's life?
I think he means taking somebody's life.
Now, there's a testimony and evidence that Mr. Routh, after he shot these 2 men, left the scene in Mr. Kyle's pickup truck, and we don't need to hash all through that. We've heard 30, 40, 50 minutes of testimony about that. Based on what you see, does it appear to you that Routh was trying to get away and flee, or going to a place where he felt safe, and that'd be his house?
You're an object. That's got to be based on speculation. There's no way he can know that.
Well, what does the evidence show you then? Where's Routh heading?
He went to his uncle's. He went to his sister's. He went to his house. I think he got his dog. He went to Taco Bell. He went to try to find a friend. He went back to his house.
Now, there's some statements when Mr. Routh is in the back of the Lancaster PD car with Officer Salazar, and he uses the word about being paranoid and schizophrenic. and he's felt this way all day. What do you make of that?
I think he was paranoid and schizophrenic all day.
And so that's what he's telling the officers, hey, I'm paranoid and schizophrenic?
Yeah, this was a statement that Dr. Rambula indicated perhaps was a setup for insanity plea, but, he was paranoid, and in my mind, he was schizophrenic, so he was simply stating the case as it was.
And we've heard today and the other day some phone calls that were intercepted by the law enforcement of Mr. Routh and his family, and Mr. Routh and Schmidl, the New Yorker magazine reporter. I guess 14 days after the date of his arrest, there was a conversation with Schmidl about talking to him. Did you go back and look at the records from the hospital regarding his dosage of medication at the VA, and if it increased, in other words, the milligram amount from Dr. Stock, I think his name was?
Yeah, Dr. Stock had increased Mr. Routh's dosage of Risperdal from 2 milligrams a day to 4 milligrams a day on January the 30th.
What does that help someone do that's schizophrenic?
Well, that's a more appropriate dosage for psychosis. So about 2 weeks before that phone call, his dosage had been increased, doubled.
Does that help folks change their behavior based on their medication?
Yeah, it's more likely that his psychosis would have been treated with that dose than with the lower dosage.
Go ahead.
If I can indicate that Dr. Rambula had said that it was unlikely that somebody's symptoms might improve after 2 weeks of medication, that sometimes it usually will take 3 to 4 weeks. But again, I don't think that's entirely true. I mean, we at the hospital will frequently see a response to treatment with antipsychotic medication, at least the initial response in 1 week. And if somebody hasn't responded within 2 weeks, we're either changing the dosage or changing the medication. We don't wait 4 weeks to see a response for psychosis. That doesn't mean that the full response will occur at 2 weeks, but we're usually seeing certainly a response of significant improvement, oftentimes by 1 and certainly by 2 weeks.
And I think Dr. Rambula talked about what's in evidence about what Eddie believed in terms of if Chris Kyle and Mr. Littlefield would try to kill him, he had to take them out first. And I'm kind of paraphrasing that. Dr. Rambula said without more information, he couldn't testify under oath that was a delusion. Was it a delusion that in Mr. Routh's mind that Chris Kyle and Mr. Littlefield were going to try to kill Eddie? Was that a delusion?
My opinion that was a delusion, yes.
And the state's trying to imply that, which would be really very tragic, extremely horrible, that Eddie took Mr. Kyle's life and Mr. Littlefield indirectly because he was jealous of Mr. Kyle's accomplishments in life with his family and the military, and it's kind of a matter of fact, I'm kind of jealous of what you've done, so I'm just going to kill you. Does that make any sense at all?
There was nothing in my interview or the clinical record that would indicate that jealousy was the motivation for this offense.
Now let's focus briefly on Dr. Price, who's seated behind the prosecutors. I don't know Dr. Raymond, but I can state that I've known Dr. Price for a long time, and actually I consider him a friend of mine, even though I might not agree with everything he testifies to. The DSM-5, how long I know we had the DSM, I know what it stands for. What does DSM stand for again?
Diagnostic and Statistical Manual.
And as Ms. Starnes held up prior to her presentation, it's kind of the Bible for folks in the field of psychiatry and psychology. Is that right?
Yeah, it's what we use for the basis of our diagnoses.
And when did the DSM-5 come out?
It was published, I believe, in 2004 2014. It might have been 2013. I think maybe the spring of 2013.
Now, you heard Dr. Price's, and you also heard, first of all, he's testified that in the history of his practice, which has been for teaching for 40 years, been a psychologist for 30 years, in the history of his practice, he's only analyzed or diagnosed in his entire history 2 folks. I don't know, I'm not that good at math. 2 folks with the possibility or probability of having a drug-induced psychosis, and more specifically, marijuana. The first one was last year. The second one was, well, maybe last year, year before last. The second one was this year. Did you go back and look at all the medical records to determine if you believe that my client had a drug-induced psychosis, most specifically with marijuana?
Yes, I did go back and review the medical records.
And more specifically, what is your scientific diagnosis of that, not just some opinion?
It's my diagnosis that he does not have a cannabis-induced psychosis, but rather that he suffers from schizophrenia.
What did the DSM-5 say about marijuana-induced psychosis specifically?
I'll actually read here. Cannabis-induced psychotic disorder may develop shortly after high-dose cannabis use and usually involves persecutory delusions, marked anxiety, emotional lability, and depersonalization. The disorder usually remits within a day, but in some cases may persist for a few days.
Now, there was an incident with, Jennifer Weed. Also, prior to the incident, I think Mr. Routh went to dinner with her parents. Is that right?
Right.
Was there any evidence of any drug usage, marijuana consumption at all during that time frame?
No. She picked him up from Lancaster on January the 17th, and then that night he was very frightened, scared. On the 18th, though, he was fine and went to dinner with her parents and reported that there was no problems at all, no evidence that he had smoked marijuana during that time. So no evidence of psychosis then.
And did anything unusual happen the next day?
Well, actually, that night, he was terrified. He thought that he was going to die. He told her that I'm going to be dead when I wake up. And
that'd be a delusion in and of itself if you're dead when you wake up, wouldn't it?
Yes, it would.
But
that was a delusion he was having, that he was going to die that night. He was absolutely terrified. And then the next morning was when he had the knife wielding incident with the ninja sword. Again, without any evidence that he had smoked marijuana just before that. So if there's no evidence that that incident was related to marijuana use at all, but it was clearly one of psychosis. He ends up going into the hospital. And then while he's at Green Oaks, admitted that day, he actually goes in with a diagnosis of psychotic disorder, NOS, and
NOS is not otherwise specified.
Not otherwise specified, right? And then the doctor who's seeing him, Dr. Eric Swafford, indicates that he's going to place him on order of protective custody because he thinks he's still psychotic. And in fact, he changed his diagnosis from psychotic disorder, not otherwise specified, to undifferentiated schizophrenia. So
wait a minute. What does that mean specifically?
Well, we talked about, kind of rule out diagnoses before, rule out psychotic disorder NOS. Dr. Swafford decided during that admission that because Mr. Routh's psychosis had actually worsened, he talked about him having worse behavior, he intimidated a nurse, that this was not some type of drug-induced psychosis or worsening, or something that cleared up after, a period of a day. This was a worsening of mental illness, and he determined that it was undifferentiated schizophrenia. In DSM-5, we don't use the subtypes anymore. That's why you haven't heard me talk about undifferentiated schizophrenia or paranoid schizophrenia. But back in early 2000, that's why you haven't heard me talk about undifferentiated schizophrenia or paranoid schizophrenia. But back in January of 2003, 2013, we were still using the DSM-4, which did have those subtypes. And Dr. Swafford also indicated that the urine drug screen was negative, meaning that there wasn't any positive findings on the urine drug screen. So that was the first time I'd caught that when I went back and reviewed those records. But at least that's what was entered. And he came, he determined that it was schizophrenia, not a psychotic disorder in OS. And he planned then for the transfer to the VA hospital.
And folks with drug-induced psychosis, you saw, or schizophrenia, you saw the behavior in the police car, how Ralph was acting calm. If folks that are under some type of drug-induced psychosis, don't they act anxious, or their behavior is not that calm, is it?
Right. As I read to you, usually these people are markedly anxious if they have a drug-induced psychosis or a cannabis-induced psychosis. And, looking at him, both in the car and also waiting for Officer Briley, he wasn't agitated. He didn't appear to be terribly anxious. He was most anxious about, getting a cigarette and getting the handcuffs off, maybe seeing his parents, but that did not look like a cannabis-induced psychosis. I guess the other thing to note is that, we already talked about how rare cannabis-induced psychosis is relative to schizophrenia. And, with this episode at Green Oaks, he then got hospitalized at the VA, and he was there for 5 more days. And on the second to last day, the doctor is still writing in there that his thoughts are disorganized. So now, after the 2 days at Jen's house, 2 days at Green Oaks, and then 3 days at the hospital, we're at 7 days. His thoughts are still disorganized. We know from reading the DSM that usually those symptoms remit after 1 day, may last a few days. So we're talking about the rare exception to a rare event, whereas schizophrenia occurs commonly.
So the explanation for that would be he's schizophrenic.
That's my belief.
And when folks that are have cannabis-induced psychosis or drug-induced psychosis in a hospital setting, don't you have to sometimes strap those folks down? They'll try to pull up on those leather straps to try to get up and scream and yell. I've seen it before. I mean, that happens, doesn't it?
The use of restraint nowadays is incredibly rare. We try to avoid that at all costs.
But I mean, in the past, that used to be the case. Is that right?
Yes, sometimes in the emergency room, if somebody who has a drug-induced psychosis, they do have to strap them down. It rarely happens in a hospital setting because they clear usually within several hours or a day or two. Certainly would be the farthest out, but not several days later.
Is there anything else you'd like to explain to the jury why you believe this was not a marijuana-induced psychosis or cannabis-induced psychosis specifically?
The fact that he would have periods where he was relatively calm and then would make his delusional statements. The fact that when he was at Gin Weeds before that incident and he hadn't smoked yet he got psychotic, I think is clear evidence that he has an underlying psychotic illness, that his episodes of psychosis are not related to the cannabis.
I'll pass one to Sean.
Good afternoon, Dr.
Good afternoon, Ms. Starnes.
You may.
You said that the defendant wasn't positive for THC or positive for drugs on the January 2013 Green Oaks admission, right?
That's what Dr. Swafford's notes indicated, yes.
You take a look at these. In fact, the defendant was positive for THC during this visit.
Yes.
And in fact, he admitted that he was a user of marijuana, hashish, and THC.
Yes.
And so that was incorrect when he said he wasn't positive during that admission.
Right, Dr. Swafford's note was incorrect.
Okay, so the records do show that he was positive for THC for marijuana during that admission.
On that urine drug screen, correct.
So that would be every hospitalization that the defendant's ever had, he was positive for some sort of cannabis product, whether it's marijuana, hashish, whatever form he's smoking it in.
Yes.
And in fact, every hospitalization he's had is either precipitated by him being very intoxicated or committed some kind of violent act.
Yes.
And he commits a violent act, and he goes to the hospital often.
Well, there's an exception. The incident where he thought he had a tapeworm, I don't think there was any violence or threat at that time.
Right, so that one though was the one where he said that he'd been smoking marijuana that was possibly laced with ammonia fluid, right?
Correct.
And then there was you've seen the records, there was a DWI where he came out saying, I'm a veteran with PTSD.
I heard that testimony.
During that arrest. And so that often, you know, you understand about cause and effect, and people have kind of learned behavior. If you do something and you get one result, then it wouldn't be unusual to try and do that again.
Correct.
And just to be clear too, on those VA records, it wasn't just psychosis, it was psychotic NOS.
Correct.
And I think we went over that the other day. That basically means we can't really tell because there's something interfering with the diagnosis, probably alcohol or drugs.
Sometimes it's that, right? Sometimes they just haven't done enough of a history.
But it means kind of we're not sure.
Correct.
I mean, and you work at a hospital, you understand that that's often kind of the shorthand though at the hospital for this person's intoxicated and we got to wait till they dry out or sober up till we make an accurate diagnosis.
Sometimes that's the case.
Now, during the, I think you had made in your testimony, you said something about the one time he went in for suicidal threats. Are you talking about the fish fry incident?
Yes.
Okay. And it was more than just suicidal threats. He was making homicidal threats to his family as well.
That's correct.
You were talking about the different delusions the defendant had. You talked about the one, his neighbor maybe was in the Mexican mafia.
Yes.
That's one of the ones that he had.
Correct.
I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with Chris and Chad, his neighbor being in the Mexican mafia.
That's right.
Or believing his neighbor's in the Mexican mafia.
Correct.
So Chad and Chris were not incorporated into that delusion.
Correct.
And then he had a delusion that his coworkers were cannibals. And again, that doesn't have anything to do with Chris and Chad.
Correct.
They weren't incorporated into that delusion. You classified him calling his girlfriend a crack whore a delusion. That sounds more like just an insult, doesn't it?
The basis of that was apparently he believed he saw something in her room or there was a crack pipe and she said that there was no such thing. So he was misinterpreting some type of stimulus as being the basis of that belief.
She did have something. You don't know that for sure, do you?
You're right. I don't know that for sure.
And then you talked about you don't think he's intoxicated because of the way he carried out the crime. Was that kind of the way he did the shooting? Is that what I heard you say?
I said, yeah, that to me, that would be at least an argument against him being intoxicated at that time because he, did tragically yet accurately fire the weapon and then drive the 105 miles.
Right. I mean, you were in the courtroom this morning when Howard Ryan was testifying.
Yes.
And so you understand that we're not talking about, more than, say, 20, 30 yards. We're talking about within feet of each other.
Yes.
So it might be easy, even if I'm not a very good shooter, I could maybe hit a target at, less than 10 feet.
Perhaps you could.
And somebody maybe even intoxicated could hit something at fairly close range, particularly if they're a trained, skilled marksman.
Yes.
And then driving 105 miles without an accident, I mean, you certainly have heard of tolerance.
Yes, I have.
And so people who are regular drinkers and regular consumers of marijuana would be expected to have some degree of tolerance, wouldn't they?
Yes.
And so you were talking about, I think there was something that Dr. Price actually had said, and it sounded like you were agreeing that if a delusion or the illness is secondary to intoxication, then the person can't come in and claim insanity. In other words, if they have cannabis-induced psychosis, that would not be insanity.
Right. If the psychosis is secondary to their cannabis induction, then in Dr. Raymond's words, the game is over.
And you're aware that the DSM-5 says for substance or medication-induced psychotic disorder, that it can actually, the symptoms can persist for a substantial period of time, for example, about a month.
Not for cannabis-induced psychosis. Sometimes we'll see that with methamphetamine-induced psychosis, particularly thought disorganization, but the DSM-4 says that in cannabis-induced psychosis, that usually remits within a day and may last for a few days.
Substance medication-induced psychotic disorder.
Right. This is a general description of a substance-induced or medication-induced psychotic disorder, but what's specific to cannabis is what I read previously when I was doing the rebuttal.
So this doesn't specifically say not cannabis.
No, but page 114 does, where I read from. Cannabis-induced psychotic disorder may develop shortly after high-dose cannabis use and usually involves persecutory delusions, marked anxiety, emotional lability, and depersonalization. The disorder usually remits within a day, but in some cases may persist for a few days.
Okay. And so high-dose cannabis use, persecutory delusions, marked anxiety, emotional lability, and depersonalization. Okay. Usually goes away within a day, but can persist for a few days.
Yeah.
And then you heard the other day, we have the defendant on the phone about 13 days after he's arrested, and he sounded markedly different than he did the night of February the 2nd, 2013.
Yes, he did.
Yeah. I mean, just because something is rare doesn't mean it doesn't happen, does it?
That's correct.
I mean, plane crashes are rare, but they happen.
Right.
Right? Capital murder is rare, but it happens.
Object, Judge, it's improper.
Overruled.
Right.
Something else that you said something about the defendant's comments about looking at computer screens in Iraq. Were you aware that that's part of an armorer's job, that they might be looking at something that's going on the outside on a computer screen?
That doesn't surprise me. I simply thought it was odd that he was mentioning that when the ranger came in to speak with him about the offense.
And you talked about, the number of people that you treat that have schizophrenia. And these are people that are in the hospital.
Correct.
And of course, they're not people in the hospital with drug-induced psychosis, because once they're sober, their psychosis goes away. Right?
Right.
Now, you were saying something about the defendant going, you don't think he was fleeing because he went back to his house? Is that what I was understanding you to say?
Actually, on the rebuttal, I didn't make a mention of the term fleeing. I was just asked to describe where he went, and I said that he went from one place to another and ended up back at his house.
Okay, and he got his dog, he went to Taco Bell. We don't really know what order that happened in, right?
Right, but when he appeared back at his house, the dog was already in his
Right,
house.
so he had gone to the house to get his dog. Perhaps he forgot something. We don't know that.
Right.
Right? You don't know that.
I don't know that.
But certainly the jury saw in the video, he flees from the Lancaster police from the front of the house.
He takes off, yes.
And certainly just because a crime doesn't make sense or is a senseless crime doesn't mean the person was insane.
Correct.
I think we talked about that the other day. There can be many other motivations for somebody to commit a crime.
There may be.
Even if they're mentally ill, they might have something that's unrelated to their mental illness, right?
Right.
I think we went through some of those. I mean, you don't think it's jealousy, but it could also just be anger or frustration, or they're irritated, or they're just having a bad day.
Those can all possibly occur when crimes
Right.
occur, right?
Even if somebody's mentally ill, they can still be mad at somebody.
That's right.
They could still be irritated by someone.
They may.
They could be offended by somebody.
Yes.
Now, there are instances certainly where the defendant has either lied to you or lied to other people. You've seen that throughout the records, haven't you?
Yes.
In fact, he lied to you when you met with him on April, was it the 14th or the 15th?
I'll have to check. I think it's the 15th, but I'll check. April the 15th.
Okay, so on April the 15th, it's when he told you that he didn't smoke marijuana that morning of February the 2nd.
Correct.
But it sounded like when you testified the other day, you were agreeing that that wasn't consistent with everything else you heard.
Right.
So he lied to you about that.
He did.
And then he, apparently, according to everything else we've seen, he lied to family members about his experiences in Haiti, about dead babies and piling them up in mass graves and that kind of thing.
Yes, again, I questioned as to when that might have been and whether it was secondary to psychosis, but certainly what he told was not the truth.
And then he told Dr. Arambula, I know I've told other people differently, but I really did know I was going to a shooting range. So he lied at some point about whether he knew he was going to a shooting range.
Yes.
And we talked about the other day the fact that, you know this from your forensic experience, when somebody is facing a serious felony charge, particularly something as serious as capital murder, they have a different motivation than somebody who's just coming to you as a treating physician.
Absolutely.
And so you're not so naive to think people don't lie to you when you're doing a forensic exam.
Correct.
Right. I mean, would you say that the defendant is an accurate historian given how many times he's lied about certain things?
No, I would not say he's an accurate historian.
And I mean, that's a term that y'all use in your profession. Somebody's not an accurate historian.
Right. That's kind of an unusual term, but it means, do they, accurately tell what happened?
I mean, the bottom line is they might tell one story to one person, they tell another story to somebody else.
Right. That would be an inaccurate historian.
It's sort of a polite doctor way of saying somebody's a liar.
Sometimes it's that. Sometimes it's confabulation or dementia. It could be practically anything. It doesn't indicate the motivation, just that they're not telling the same story consistently.
It just means they're not truthful for whatever reason.
Right. But again, if we use that in dementia, we don't use that in terms of truthfulness. It's just that they don't tell the same story each time.
Right. I mean, you're not saying the defendant has dementia, though.
No, I'm not. I'm just trying to clarify the term.
But it could just be a plain old lie.
Right.
And so the defendant tells you the story about the pig assassins and the hybrid pig people, people turning into half pig, half human.
Yes.
And you were in here and you heard that he just, 3 days before that, he's on the phone talking about watching this show, Boss Hog.
Right.
That has to do with pigs.
Yes.
Has to do with hunting pigs.
Correct.
Barbecuing pigs.
Yes.
Heard the other day that their main character is called Pigman.
I did.
Did you go over the weekend and look anything up about that show?
I did not.
Did you look up anything about the Seinfeld episode about Pigman?
No, I didn't.
Did you go and look up the Twilight Zone episode where everybody looks like a pig except the attractive woman? It's called Eye of the Beholder.
No, I didn't look that up.
Have you seen that before?
No, I haven't.
I mean, there's plenty of stuff out there in TV or media, movies about pig people. Right?
Right.
And
what you said.
Let me ask you this. If Eddie Routh were a deaf and mute person and couldn't tell you that he was having this delusion about pig people, where would you get that? I mean, how would you determine that, whether he was having that delusion?
If he couldn't communicate to me at all,
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't know.
If he couldn't communicate to you about whether he knew his actions were wrong, how would you know that? Would you be able to look at his actions and tell that he knew what he did was wrong?
No, I wouldn't be able to.
You don't think that's possible to look at someone's actions and tell that they knew what they did was wrong?
No, in some cases you certainly may, but based on what he has told us, I believe that he did not know that.
And you've already said, though, he's a very inaccurate historian.
Yes.
And you heard this morning, well, actually, it was early this afternoon, when we played again that 13-minute or so conversation with the reporter from the New Yorker about the crime. You heard him discuss that.
Yes.
He kind of discusses it in pretty elaborate detail, doesn't he?
Yeah, he's pretty descriptive.
And that was, what, 4 months after the crime happened.
Right.
Nothing in there about hybrid pig people or people turning into pigs.
Right, nothing about pigs.
And in fact, he didn't say he was afraid of these men until the reporter reminded him, didn't you tell your sister that you felt a fear of them or threatened by them?
Correct.
We asked you the other day, you understand that what is the legal definition of wrong when you do a forensic examination of someone for sanity?
By case law here in Texas, it's illegal.
Okay. I mean, you understand that people can commit violent acts and crimes that might be unrelated to their mental illness.
Absolutely.
You understand that the law requires that it's as a result of their mental illness, and that for them to not know that their conduct was wrong.
Yeah, I'm quite familiar with the definition.
Okay. And I think we went over a bunch of things the other day about things that he either told you or actions that would indicate that he knew what he did was wrong.
We went over the things he told me. Yes.
Are you aware of a VA record from January the 30th, 2013?
Yes,
Dr. You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
And then there's actually, now I think you said something at one point about the dosage of Risperdal. And so he was increased to 2 milligrams.
2 milligrams twice daily, correct.
On 130.
Yes.
Have you ever prescribed that dosage of Risperdal to a patient?
Many times.
For what?
Psychosis.
2 milligrams.
2 milligrams twice daily, yes.
Okay. For anything
common
else?
Dosage.
For anything else?
I said common dosage. I believe I've used that for bipolar disorder, although that would perhaps be 1 or 2 times.
And that's a mood disorder.
Yes.
Okay. And now, I thought though I had heard you say 4 milligrams was more appropriate for psychosis.
2 milligrams twice daily is 4 milligrams.
Okay. And then, but actually the defendant has been on 2 milligrams for a long time, hasn't he?
2 milligrams twice daily, yes.
And have you ever prescribed that dosage for anything besides psychosis?
I told you I may have prescribed that dosage for bipolar disorder a couple of times.
But that's because the majority of the people that you see are schizophrenic.
In the state hospital, the majority have psychotic illnesses, schizophrenia, or schizoaffective disorder, as I testified.
Right. So I mean, that's the majority of the people that are in your under your care or that you see in your private practice.
Risperdal is not usually a first choice medicine for bipolar disorder.
But it can be used for that.
It can be used, and they have received approval for that.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
I'm going to show you this note from 130 from the VA hospital, so you kind of know what I'm talking about. Do you have that in your record somewhere?
Yes, I do. This is actually not from 130. This here, that's an addendum from March the 12th.
Right, but they're talking about the 130-13 visit.
Right, yeah, Dr. Stock's visit.
Right. So you know what I'm talking about.
Yes, absolutely.
So this is another doctor, Dr. Westhafer, talking about the Dr. Stock visit on 1:30.
Yes.
And you realize that this doctor says that the defendant, as of his last appointment on 1:30, his thought process was identified as linear. He was fully oriented to name, date, location, and situation, right?
Yes.
His behavior was cooperative with fair eye contact.
Yes.
Insight and judgment were fair.
Right.
He has no noted suicidal or homicidal ideation.
Right.
There was no symptom of mood disorder. I'm sorry, while he did have possible symptoms of mood disorder, possibly mixed bipolar disorder, which were addressed.
What do
Right.
you mean? What do you mean? Which were addressed?
It says he did not have symptoms of mood disorder, possibly mixed bipolar disorder, which were addressed.
I think he means by increasing the Risperdal.
Well, and then it says, while previous diagnosis includes psychosis NOS, there was no noted evidence of hallucinations, delusions, or other symptoms of an active thought disorder on 1:30:13. Says that, right?
Yes, you have that note. I don't have that note. But I'm actually looking at Dr. Stock's note that he's quoting from, so I know what he's referencing.
Be happy to show it to you.
It's okay.
Okay. I mean, you believe that it's in there.
Yes,
There are lots of records.
there are.
And so we know, though, between 1:30:13 and 2:2:13, the defendant smoked marijuana, drank alcohol on February 1st, right?
Yes,
And he also smoked marijuana and drank alcohol on February 2nd.
correct.
Now, going back, talking about the Risperdal, the defendant was actually on 2 milligrams of Risperdal per day for about a year before the date of this crime. Right?
He'd been prescribed that. He had stopped taking it for a decent portion in 2012.
Okay. But that's what he was on up until 1:30 is when they increased it.
Correct.
And now, you didn't go to Green Oaks Hospital and talk to Dr. Swafford, did you?
I did not.
So you don't know the reason why he put down the diagnosis he did.
In the note, he indicated that psychosis was worsening.
Well, you actually said that he intimidated a nurse. He actually threatened and kind of assaulted the person, didn't he?
It appeared that he backed her up into a corner or something of that nature. So you can use the word intimidation, you can use the word threatened, but his behavior was certainly frightening to her.
Right. But you didn't go and sit down in person and talk with Dr. Swafford.
I did not.
Do you know how much time he actually spent with the defendant?
I do not.
Would it surprise you if he said 10 minutes one day and 30 seconds the next?
No.
I mean, that would be about typical for a hospital that busy.
In the psychiatric emergency services, that wouldn't surprise me.
And would it surprise you if he said that a lot of his diagnosis was based on the defendant's age?
Well, that was a very typical age for schizophrenia. If that's what he said, then that wouldn't be surprising.
Would it surprise you if he said he wanted to make sure the defendant went to the VA hospital and wasn't back on the street?
That wouldn't be a surprising thing to hear.
Because he knows that the defendant is being put there for this threatening incident with the knife.
Correct.
And so you were incorrect about him not being positive for THC on the January 19th hospitalization.
You're right. I saw that in the note, but I was definitely incorrect about that.
I mean, and certainly you weren't with the defendant and Jen Weed around the time of that knife incident.
I was not.
You're basing it on either her telling you the truth or the defendant telling you the truth about that.
Yes.
And you said he's not an accurate historian.
There's certainly evidence that he told one thing to one person and another thing to another person.
There's lots of it.
Yes.
Pass the witness.
Very briefly, Your Honor. So you heard Dr. Price indicate that my client Eddie has average intelligence.
Yes.
And so his indication and what you read in the records about Jen being a pig hybrid, and is that a delusion?
It's my opinion that that is a delusion. Yes.
And you've been asked questions about when you examined respect to my client Eddie Ralph, is that right?
Yes.
That was on April the 15th of 2014?
Yes.
So he's pretty darn smart to know that you're going to come see him on April the 15th, 2014 when he's being interrogated by Texas Ranger Briley on February the 2nd, 2013, didn't he? He's pretty brilliant, isn't he?
He did make mention of pigs and pig excrement on that day.
I guess he had some great revelation that a physician who's an expert in the world of psychiatry was going to come see him. He could talk about pigs. So you remember when he told Briley, well, I keep talking to Chris, I keep talking to Chris's in the world. Every time I talk to another man named Chris, I get sent another man named Chris. I think about talking to the wolf, the one in the sky. I think about fighting through war, The ones in the sky are the ones that fly, you know what I mean? The pigs in the world can truly say that they're pigs. He's pretty darn smart to figure out you're going to come see him over a year later.
I don't think that's why he said that stuff.
I've been smelling it this whole time. I'm just tired of, pardon my French, everyone's fucking bullshit. I can smell bullshit and pig shit, I can tell the difference between two different kinds of pig shit. He's darn smart, isn't he?
That would be one interpretation.
I don't know how you can smell your shit. I'm not saying nobody's shit stinking, but shit's stinking, So all this surmised by the state of Texas that they want to think he has some great pig revelation in April, he was pretty darn smart to know that you come to see him over a year later, wasn't he?
I think he was psychotic on February 2nd, 2013.
I approach the board, Your Honor.
Right.
So let me make sure we understand, at the time of the conduct charged, my client, as a result of severe mental disease or defect, did not know his conduct was wrong. Do you agree or disagree with that?
I agree.
So was he schizophrenic?
Yes.
Was he psychotic?
Yes.
Did he have some mood disorder that caused him to take the life of these two fine men?
I don't think it was a mood disorder.
Was he have some kind of psychosis induced by marijuana that caused him to take the life?
I don't think it was a marijuana-induced psychosis.
Fascinating.
He shot both of these men, shot one of them 6 times, and one either 6 or 7, depending on whether one of the bullets exited and re-entered, right?
Yes.
And he reloaded a 9mm weapon before he fled the crime scene.
Yes.
In fact, he used that word himself, I fled.
Yes.
And he didn't call the police for that 105-mile journey.
Correct.
Judge, I would suggest to the court, this is beyond repetitious. Ask and answer, object. It's not rebuttal to anything, Your Honor.
Overall limit.
Went to Taco Bell and even said he went there because he knew he was going to be arrested.
Yes.
Went and got his dog
Yes.
because he's not going to leave town without that beloved dog.
I don't know what the motivation was, but he got his dog.
That makes sense, though, that he loves that dog. He's not going to leave without it.
Right.
And then he got in that standoff with the police. He knew they were surrounding him.
Yes.
And then we see him peel out and go on a high-speed chase.
Correct.
And then we saw him get out of the truck with his hands up, and he complied with demands.
He did.
And then he told you it's a pretty shitty thing to do to kill someone.
Right.
He told you, I just shot 2 guys, that's terrible.
Yes.
He told you, it says in the Bible not to kill anybody.
Correct.
Asked if other people would understand what he did, he told you, I figured I'd be arrested.
Yes.
You know you're going to be arrested if you know you did something illegal, right?
You know you're going to be arrested if you've killed somebody. He would have to explain why.
He said, he told you, as soon as I did it, I knew I'd made a mistake.
Yes.
He told other people things about fleeing and why he did what he did.
He also told people he had to kill them because they were going to kill him.
And so we have to believe him that he's telling the truth, though, to believe that, right?
Right. If you don't believe that he thought he was going to be killed, then you don't believe that.
And so the whole premise of him saying, you know, I thought I was in fear for my life, we have to believe that he's telling us the truth about that.
True.
Pass the witness.
Well, his perception would be his own perception, correct?
Right.
It goes to what he's believing at the time of the specific event, is that correct?
Exactly.
And that's a question of fact for this jury to figure out, nobody else.
That's their job.
No further questions.
I have no further questions for Dr. Dunn.
Aren't you may step down?